What if I told you that a single moment of disrespect cost a luxury hotel $3.7 billion? Not a natural disaster, not a business scandal, just one comment, 8 words, that shattered the biggest deal in corporate history. Have you ever walked into a room where you felt like you didn't belong? Where your success was questioned before you even opened your mouth? Where people looked at you and saw everything except your achievements? If you've ever felt underestimated because of who you are, hit that like button. This story is for you. Because what you're about to hear will change how you think about standing up for yourself forever. This is the story of Darius Monroe, a Black CEO who went from the streets of Southeast Atlanta to the penthouse boardrooms of Wall Street. A man who built a multi-billion-dollar technology empire from nothing. A man who carried the weight of breaking barriers every single day of his career. On a September morning that started like any other, Darius woke up knowing this would be the most important day of his professional life. After months of negotiations, handshakes, and late-night strategy sessions, he was about to finalize a $3.7 billion merger deal that would reshape the entire tech industry. $3.7 billion. Let that sink in for a moment. That's not just money. That's the kind of life-changing deal that secures the future of thousands of employees, transforms entire communities, and cements a legacy that lasts generations. The meeting was set at the Bellevue Royale, one of those luxury hotels where the marble floors gleam like mirrors and the crystal chandeliers cost more than most people's houses. This was where the elite came to make deals that moved markets and changed the world. Darius had earned his seat at that table. Years of 18-hour days, countless rejections, and proving himself over and over again in rooms where he was often the only person who looked like him. His company, Westgate Innovations, had become a force in the tech world, developing cutting-edge solutions that connected communities and empowered voices that had been ignored for too long. But success hadn't made the journey easier. Every achievement came with an invisible tax. The constant need to prove he belonged, to show that his wins weren't luck or charity, but the result of brilliance, hard work, and relentless determination. That morning, as he prepared for the biggest moment of his career, Darius slipped something into his wallet that represented everything he'd accomplished. A sleek, titanium American Express Centurion card, the legendary black card that only a select few in the world could even qualify for. It wasn't just a credit card. It was a symbol of financial power, exclusivity, and the kind of success that most people only dream about. The irony wasn't lost on him. A black man carrying a black card into a world that had spent centuries telling people like him they didn't belong. As his car pulled up to the Bellevue Royale, Darius felt the familiar weight of expectations settling on his shoulders. Not just the pressure of the deal, but the responsibility of representation. Every move he made would be scrutinized. Every word would be measured. Every decision would reflect not just on him, but on everyone who looked like him and dared to dream big. The hotel lobby stretched before him like a golden cathedral, soaring ceilings, polished marble that reflected the morning light, and an atmosphere that whispered of power and prestige. Staff members moved with practiced precision, their smiles perfectly calibrated for the wealthy clientele they served. But here's what most people don't understand about spaces like this. They're not just buildings. They're gatekeepers. They're places where unspoken rules determine who gets respect and who gets questioned. Where the color of your skin can matter more than the color of your money. Darius had navigated these spaces his entire career. He knew the game. He understood the subtle glances, the micro-expressions, the way conversations shifted when he entered a room. He learned to armor himself with impeccable suits, flawless manners, and achievements so undeniable that even the most stubborn prejudices had to acknowledge them. What he didn't know was that in the next 10 minutes, a hotel clerk's casual comment would force him to make a choice that would echo through boardrooms around the world. A choice between dignity and dollars. A choice that would prove that some things, some principles, are worth more than any amount of money. Are you ready to see what happened when a man decided his self-respect was worth $3.7 billion? Because what comes next will leave you speechless. To understand what happened next, you need to know where Darius Monroe came from. Because the distance between Southeast Atlanta and the marble halls of the Bellevue Royale isn't just measured in miles, it's measured in dreams deferred, barriers broken, and battles fought in silence. Growing up in a neighborhood where opportunity was scarce and hope was a luxury, Darius learned early that the world would judge him before he ever got a chance to prove himself. His mother, a schoolteacher who worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on, would tell him every night, "Son, you're going to have to work twice as hard to get half the recognition. But that doesn't mean you settle for less. It means you become undeniable." His father ran a small electronics repair shop, barely making ends meet, but he taught Darius something that would shape his entire career. Dignity isn't negotiable. No matter how much money they wave in your face, no matter how they try to make you feel small, you never let anyone treat you like you're less than human. Have you ever had to represent more than just yourself? Have you ever walked into a room knowing that your success or failure would be used to judge an entire community? That's the weight Darius carried every single day. When he became the first in his family to attend college, when he graduated top of his class from business school, when he founded Westgate Innovations in a cramped apartment with nothing but a laptop and a dream, every achievement wasn't just his own. It was a statement, a declaration that excellence has no color. Building his company from the ground up meant facing rejection after rejection. Investors who smiled to his face but never returned his calls. Partners who questioned his strategy not because it was flawed, but because they couldn't believe someone who looked like him could have developed it. Meetings where he was asked to prove his credentials over and over again, while his white counterparts were simply believed. But Darius persisted. He built Westgate Innovations into a technology powerhouse that connected underserved communities to digital opportunities. His company didn't just make money, it made a difference. Every product, every service, every innovation was designed to level the playing field for people who had been left behind by the digital revolution. The morning light filtering through the hotel's towering windows cast everything in a golden glow. Guests moved through the lobby with the quiet confidence that comes from never having to question whether they belonged. Designer luggage rolled across marble floors that reflected the faces of people who looked like they owned the world. This was the environment where the $3.7 billion deal would be sealed. Not just any deal. This was the merger that would catapult Westgate Innovations from a respected company to a global giant. The kind of deal that would create jobs for thousands, fund scholarships for hundreds of students, and establish the technology infrastructure that would transform entire communities. But more than that, this deal represented something deeper. It was validation that a Black-owned business could compete at the highest levels. It was proof that diversity wasn't just a buzzword, it was a business advantage. It was the kind of success that would inspire the next generation of entrepreneurs who looked like Darius and dared to dream big. The black card in his wallet wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of how far he'd traveled from those streets in Southeast Atlanta. The American Express Centurion card, invitation only, reserved for people who spend hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. It represented access to a world that had historically been closed to people like him. How many times had he been followed in stores? How many times had waiters handed the check to his white dinner companions, assuming he couldn't afford to pay? How many times had he been asked to show additional ID when his credit card should have been enough? The card was his armor against those assumptions. It was his way of saying, I belong here. I've earned my place at this table. My money spends just like yours. Walking through the Bellevue Royale that morning, Darius felt the familiar tension between confidence and caution. The hotel staff, impeccably trained and professionally polite, moved with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Everything was designed to make guests feel important, valued, respected. But beneath the surface, Darius sensed something else. The way conversations paused when he passed. The momentary hesitation before smiles appeared. The subtle double takes from other guests who seemed surprised to see someone who looked like him in such an exclusive space. He'd learned to read these signals over the years. The micro-expressions that revealed true thoughts. The barely perceptible shifts in body language that spoke louder than words. The way respect was offered cautiously, as if it might be revoked at any moment. This was the reality of being a black executive in America. Success didn't eliminate racism. It just made it more sophisticated. The slurs became suggestions. The barriers became bureaucracy. The hatred became subtle hints that you didn't quite fit. But Darius had made peace with this reality. He'd learned to navigate these spaces with grace, to rise above the petty prejudices and focus on the bigger goals. He'd built his career on the foundation his parents had laid. Work harder, be better, prove them wrong. The merger documents were in his briefcase. The contracts were ready for signatures. The future of his company hung in the balance. But what happened next would change everything. Darius approached the reception desk with the measured confidence of a man who had earned his place in every room he entered. The morning rush was in full swing. Guests checking in, bellhops wheeling luggage across the polished floors, the quiet hum of efficient service that made the Bellevue Royale legendary. The young clerk behind the mahogany counter looked up as he approached. Clean-cut, probably fresh out of college, with the kind of eager smile that suggested he was still new enough to care about making a good impression. His name tag read Brandon. "Good morning, sir. How may I assist you today?" "I need to confirm the reservation for the Westgate Innovations boardroom meeting," Darius said, sliding his identification across the counter. "We're expecting several executives this morning for our merger presentation." Brandon's fingers flew across the keyboard, his expression professional and focused. "Absolutely, Mr. Monroe. I see your reservation here. The Wellington Conference Suite, correct? Your catering has been confirmed, and the A/V equipment is ready." "Perfect. I'd also like to ensure the charges are properly processed." Darius reached into his wallet and produced the black card, the titanium surface catching the light like a mirror. "Please run this for the incidentals." The moment Brandon's eyes fell on the card, something shifted. The professional smile flickered. His eyebrows raised slightly, and he picked up the card with the kind of careful examination usually reserved for suspicious documents. He turned it over in his hands, studying it as if he'd never seen one before. The silence stretched for 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15. "Sir," Brandon said finally, his voice carrying a tone that made Darius's stomach tighten. "I wasn't expecting to see a card like this. Are you sure you belong in our establishment?" The words hit like a physical blow. Time seemed to freeze. The bustling lobby faded into background noise. The comfortable morning energy evaporated, replaced by something cold and sharp that cut through Darius's chest. "Are you sure you belong?" 8 words. 26 letters. A lifetime of conditioning packed into a single sentence that stripped away every achievement, every success, every hard-won victory, and reduced him to a stereotype. Drop a comment if you've experienced something similar. You're not alone. Because what happened next reveals the invisible war that successful black professionals fight every single day. The first wave was pure shock. In all his years of carrying that card, in all the exclusive restaurants and private clubs and luxury hotels, no one had ever questioned its authenticity. The black card wasn't just rare, it was virtually impossible to fake. The weight, the texture, the holographic security features, everything about it screamed legitimacy. But that wasn't what Brandon was questioning, was it? The second wave was recognition. This wasn't about the card. This was about the man holding it. A black man in a $1,000 suit, carrying a symbol of wealth that some people would never see in their lifetime, walking into a space where he clearly, in Brandon's mind, didn't belong. Darius felt his jaw clench. His fingers tightened around the leather portfolio in his left hand. The merger documents inside suddenly felt heavier, more fragile, as if they might crumble under the weight of this moment. Excuse me. The words came out steady, controlled, but Darius could hear the dangerous quiet in his own voice. Brandon seemed to realize he'd crossed a line, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. I mean, we don't usually see, well, you know, cards like this. From people like. I just need to verify it's legitimate. People like me. The third wave was memory. A flood of moments that Darius thought he'd left behind, buried under years of success and achievement. The department store security guard who followed him through the electronics section when he was shopping for his first computer. The restaurant host who told him they were fully booked while seating a white family who'd arrived after him. The bank loan officer who questioned his business plan with a skepticism that bordered on hostility, asking for additional documentation that his white competitors never had to provide. The college professor who suggested he might be more comfortable in a less challenging course. The venture capitalist who praised his natural rhythm instead of his financial projections. The board member who asked if he'd gotten his position through diversity initiatives rather than merit. Each memory was a small cut, a tiny wound that had healed over but left a scar. And now, standing in the lobby of the Bellevue Royale, holding a piece of titanium that represented everything he'd accomplished, those scars were ripping open all at once. The fourth wave was rage. Pure, white-hot fury that started in his chest and spread through his limbs like electricity. The kind of anger that makes your vision narrow and your heart pound and your hands shake with the effort of staying in control. He'd earned this card. He'd earned this respect. He'd earned the right to walk into any establishment on the planet without having to prove his worth to some 20-something clerk who probably made in a year what Darius spent on business lunches. But the rage was followed immediately by something else, calculation. The boardroom was upstairs. The merger partners were arriving in 30 minutes. The biggest deal of his career was hanging in the balance, and he was standing in a hotel lobby being treated like a criminal. What would his parents say? Work twice as hard, get half the recognition, but never let them see you sweat. Keep your dignity. Stay professional. Rise above it. What would his employees say? The hundreds of people whose livelihoods depended on this deal going through. The communities that would benefit from the expanded services. The young entrepreneurs who were counting on Westgate Innovations to pave the way for their own success. But then another voice whispered in his ear. The voice of every black professional who had ever swallowed their pride for the sake of the business. Every executive who had smiled through the microaggressions and pretended the slights didn't hurt. Every leader who had chosen the path of least resistance instead of the path of principle. How many times had he been in this exact position? How many times had he let it slide, laughed it off, made excuses for other people's ignorance because the alternative was too costly? The lobby seemed to pulse around him. Other guests were starting to notice the tension at the reception desk. A few heads turned in their direction. Conversations quieted. Brandon was still holding the card, waiting for. What? An explanation? An apology? Proof that a black man could legitimately possess something that valuable? The card is legitimate, Darius said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years of suppressed frustration. The question is whether this establishment is legitimate enough to deserve my business. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Brandon's face went pale. He set the card down on the counter with trembling fingers. Sir, I didn't mean, you meant exactly what you said. Darius picked up the card, his movements deliberate and controlled. The only question now is what I'm going to do about it. The decision was crystallizing in his mind. The merger. The deal. The future of his company. Everything was about to change, and Brandon had no idea what he'd just set in motion. The elevator ride to the 14th floor felt like an eternity. Darius stood alone in the mahogany-paneled chamber, watching the floor numbers climb while his mind raced through the implications of what had just happened. The soft hum of the elevator's motor seemed to mock the chaos roiling inside his chest. 14 floors. 60 seconds. A lifetime of preparation hanging in the balance. The marble walls of the elevator reflected his image back at him, impeccably dressed, composed, successful. But behind the polished exterior, a war was raging. Every fiber of his being screamed for justice, while his rational mind calculated the cost of principle. $3.7 billion. The number echoed in his head like a drumbeat. Not just money, futures, dreams. The difference between Westgate Innovations becoming a global powerhouse and remaining a successful but limited player in the technology sector. His phone buzzed. A text from his CFO, partners arriving in 15 minutes. Everything ready on your end. Everything ready. If only it were that simple. The elevator doors opened to reveal a hallway that belonged in a palace. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across walls adorned with original artwork. The carpet beneath his feet was so plush it seemed to absorb sound itself. Every detail screamed luxury, exclusivity, privilege. The same privilege that had just been weaponized against him in the lobby. Darius walked slowly toward the Wellington Conference Suite, his footsteps muffled by the expensive carpet. With each step, the weight of the decision pressed down harder on his shoulders. What would you do if your dignity was the price of success? The question wasn't theoretical anymore. It was real, immediate, and demanding an answer that would define not just his career, but his character. He stopped outside the conference room doors, his hand resting on the cold brass handle. Inside, everything was ready. The presentation slides were loaded. The contracts were printed and organized. The catering had been arranged. His team had spent months preparing for this moment. But all he could hear was Brandon's voice. "Are you sure you belong in our establishment?" The words cut deeper because they weren't new. They were the same words he'd been hearing his entire life, dressed up in different clothes, delivered with varying degrees of sophistication, but carrying the same poisonous message: you don't belong here. He thought about his mother, grading papers at the kitchen table late into the night, telling him that education was the key to breaking barriers. "Son," she'd say, "they can't argue with excellence. You make yourself so good, so undeniable, that they have no choice but to respect you." But here he was, undeniably successful, carrying a card that proved his financial worth, about to close a deal that would cement his company's place in history, and he was still being questioned about whether he belonged. He thought about his father, working in that tiny repair shop, his hands stained with solder and his back bent over circuit boards. "Dignity isn't negotiable," he'd said. "The moment you start trading your self-respect for money, you lose something you can never get back." Easy words to say when you're talking about a few $100s. Harder to live by when the stakes are measured in billions. The conference room doors seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Beyond those doors was the future he'd dreamed of, the validation he'd worked for, the platform that would allow him to lift up entire communities. But to get there, he had to walk past the insult. He had to pretend that Brandon's words didn't matter. He had to smile and shake hands and make small talk with people who might be thinking the same thing Brandon had been brave enough to say out loud. The hallway around him told a story of power and prestige. Oil paintings of distinguished men, all white, all stern, all confident in their right to be there. Persian rugs that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Furniture that had been handcrafted by artisans whose names were lost to history. This was the world he'd fought to enter. The world that had resisted his presence at every turn, but now courted his business because his success was too big to ignore. The contrast was stark and painful. All this beauty, all this luxury, built on a foundation of exclusion. All this elegance hiding the ugly truth that some people's worth was still measured by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. His employees were counting on him. Sarah from accounting, who'd just bought her first house. Marcus from engineering, who was saving for his daughter's college tuition. The entire research and development team, whose innovations would reach millions of people if this deal went through. How could he justify putting his personal feelings above their welfare? How could he risk their jobs, their security, their futures because of one ignorant comment from a hotel clerk? But then another voice whispered in his ear. The voice of every black professional who had ever stood at this same crossroads. Every executive who had chosen silence over speaking up. Every leader who had swallowed their pride and called it pragmatism. What message would his silence send? That success meant accepting disrespect? That black achievement came with the condition of tolerating racism? That the price of admission to elite spaces was the willingness to endure whatever humiliation was necessary? The merger partners would arrive in 10 minutes. The documents were ready. The future was waiting. But standing in that hallway, surrounded by all the trappings of success, Darius realized something profound. The most important decision of his career wasn't about money. It wasn't about market share or competitive advantage or quarterly profits. It was about what kind of man he wanted to be, what kind of leader he wanted to be remembered as, what kind of legacy he wanted to leave for the next generation of black executives who would follow in his footsteps. The conference room doors loomed before him. Inside was everything he'd worked for, everything he'd sacrificed for, everything he'd dreamed of. But first, he had to decide, was he going to be the CEO who let it slide or the man who drew the line? The Wellington Conference Suite was a temple to corporate power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city skyline, while the centerpiece, a massive mahogany table that could seat 20 executives, dominated the room like an altar where billion-dollar decisions were made. Everything about the space whispered authority, from the leather chairs that cost more than most cars to the crystal water glasses that caught the morning light like diamonds. Darius stood at the head of the table, his presentation remote in hand, watching as the most powerful people in the technology industry filed into the room. These weren't just executives, they were titans. CEOs whose companies shaped global markets, investors whose decisions moved stock prices, lawyers whose contracts redefined entire industries. Richard Blackstone, the lead partner from Meridian Capital, took his seat with the confidence of a man who'd closed more billion-dollar deals than most people would see in a lifetime. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his Italian suit tailored to perfection, and his handshake carried the weight of old money and older power. "Darius," Richard said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of private schools and Ivy League connections. "I have to say, your team's due diligence has been extraordinary. This merger will reshape the entire landscape of digital infrastructure." The other partners nodded in agreement. Margaret Shin from Pacific Ventures, David Rodriguez from Summit Holdings, James Harrison from Blackwater International. Each name represented billions in assets, thousands of employees, and the kind of influence that moved markets. "The numbers are impressive," Margaret added, scanning the preliminary documents. "Your user acquisition metrics, your revenue projections, your intellectual property portfolio, everything indicates this will be one of the most successful mergers in tech history." Darius felt the familiar surge of pride. His company, his vision, his relentless pursuit of excellence, all of it validated by the most respected voices in the industry. This was the moment he'd dreamed of since those early days in his cramped apartment, building code until his eyes burned and his fingers cramped. "Before we begin," he said, his voice steady and professional, "I want to thank everyone for their confidence in Westgate Innovations. This partnership represents more than financial opportunity. It's a chance to democratize technology access for communities that have been overlooked for too long." The presentation began flawlessly. Slide after slide of market analysis, growth projections, and strategic advantages. The merger would create synergies worth billions, expand into new markets, and establish the combined entity as the undisputed leader in digital infrastructure. Richard leaned forward, his eyes bright with the kind of excitement that came from recognizing a once-in-a-generation opportunity. The African expansion alone could generate $2 billion in revenue within 5 years. And your community outreach programs, brilliant. Profit with purpose. That's the future of business. But as the presentation continued, Something shifted in Darius's chest. The words from the lobby kept echoing in his mind. Are you sure you belong in our establishment? He looked around the table at these powerful, successful, respected individuals. How many of them had ever been questioned about whether they belonged? How many had ever had their achievements dismissed, their credentials doubted, their very presence in elite spaces treated as suspicious? The answer was written in their faces. The unconscious confidence. The assumption that respect was their birthright. The luxury of never having to prove they deserved to be in the room. The integration timeline is aggressive but achievable, David was saying, pointing to a chart on the screen. With our combined resources, we can accelerate deployment by 18 months. Darius nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about Brandon downstairs, probably serving other guests with the same professional courtesy he denied a black CEO. He was thinking about his father's words, dignity isn't negotiable. He was thinking about the message his silence would send to every black professional who would come after him. The presentation reached its crescendo, the final slide showing projected revenues, market share, and the transformative impact of the merger. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Gentlemen, Richard said, his voice filled with satisfaction. This is exactly the kind of deal that defines careers. Darius, you've built something extraordinary here. The contracts were ready. The lawyers had their pens poised. The future was waiting for a signature. But instead of reaching for his pen, Darius set down his presentation remote and looked directly at each person around the table. There's something I need to address before we proceed, he said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone lean forward slightly. The room grew quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when everyone senses that something significant is about to happen. This morning, as I was confirming our arrangements downstairs, I experienced something that I cannot ignore. When I presented my American Express Centurion card, a card that, as you all know, is issued only to individuals with exceptional financial credentials, the hotel clerk questioned whether I belonged in this establishment. A ripple of surprise went through the room. Margaret's eyebrows raised. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. James cleared his throat. The clerk's exact words were, "Are you sure you belong in our establishment?" He questioned not the legitimacy of the card, but the legitimacy of the man holding it. Richard's face darkened. That's completely unacceptable. We'll have a conversation with hotel management immediately. With respect, Richard, that's not enough. Darius's voice was growing stronger, more resolute. For 30 years, I've built my career on the belief that excellence would eventually overcome prejudice. I've worked twice as hard, achieved twice as much, and carried myself with twice the dignity of my competitors, all in service of proving that I belonged at tables like this. The room was completely silent now. The only sound was the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the distant noise of traffic 14 floors below. But this morning, I realized something profound. I've been approaching this all wrong. I've been trying to prove that I belong in spaces that were built to exclude me. I've been seeking validation from institutions that profit from discrimination while maintaining a veneer of respectability. Margaret started to speak, but Darius held up his hand. This merger would be worth $3.7 billion. It would secure the future of my company, provide jobs for thousands of employees, and establish Westgate Innovations as a global leader. By any rational measure, I should sign these contracts and move forward. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the room. But I won't. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face went pale. Margaret's mouth fell open. David stared in disbelief. I'm canceling the deal. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. James actually gasped. Margaret's water glass slipped from her fingers, but she caught it before it hit the table. Darius, Richard said, his voice strained, you can't be serious. This is $3.7 billion we're talking about. I'm completely serious. Darius's voice was calm, resolute, final. I refuse to build my company's future on a foundation that tolerates discrimination. I refuse to shake hands with partners while swallowing the bitter taste of disrespect. I refuse to teach the next generation of Black executives that success requires accepting humiliation. Share this if you believe no amount of money is worth your self-respect. This hotel, this establishment, this entire system operates on the assumption that people like me should be grateful for the opportunity to be insulted while conducting business. That assumption ends today. The room erupted in protests. Voices overlapping, executives pleading, lawyers frantically shuffling papers. But Darius remained standing, unmoved by the chaos he'd unleashed. "The decision is final," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Westgate Innovations will not be party to this merger. Good day, gentlemen." He walked toward the door, leaving behind $3.7 billion and a room full of stunned executives who had just witnessed the most expensive stand for dignity in corporate history. The elevator descended in silence, but Darius's mind was anything but quiet. As the floor numbers counted down 14, 13, 12, the magnitude of what he'd just done began to crystallize. He'd walked away from $3.7 billion. He'd canceled the biggest deal in his company's history. He'd just made a decision that would echo through the business world for years to come. The elevator doors opened to reveal a lobby that looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago. The same marble floors, the same crystal chandeliers, the same guests moving through with their quiet confidence. But everything had changed. Brandon was still at the reception desk, helping another guest with their reservation. He looked up as Darius passed, his face showing a flicker of recognition and confusion. The CEO who'd been questioned about his credentials was now walking through the lobby with a different kind of energy. Not the controlled professionalism of before, but something that felt like liberation. Darius didn't stop. He didn't explain. He simply walked out of the Bellevue Royale and into the morning air, leaving behind the most expensive rejection in corporate history. The weight that had been pressing on his shoulders for 30 years, the weight of proving himself, of representing his community, of carrying the expectations of everyone who looked like him, suddenly felt lighter. For the first time in his career, he'd chosen principle over profit, dignity over dollars. His phone started buzzing before he reached his car. First, it was his CFO. "Darius, what happened?" "The partners are calling. They're saying the deal is off." Then his head of legal. "Boss, we need to talk." The contracts were ready to sign. "What's going on?" Then his assistant. "Mr. Monroe, I have 17 missed calls from reporters. They're saying you canceled the merger?" News traveled fast in the interconnected world of high finance. Within 30 minutes of Darius leaving the conference room, the story was spreading through the networks that connected Wall Street to Silicon Valley, from corporate boardrooms to trading floors. The first headline appeared on Financial Wire at 10:47 a.m. Breaking: Westgate Innovations CEO cancels $3.7 billion merger deal over alleged discrimination by 11:15 a.m. The story had been picked up by every major business publication. The Wall Street Journal. Black CEO walks away from billion-dollar deal after hotel incident. Forbes. Dignity over dollars. Tech giant cancels merger after racist encounter. Bloomberg. Westgate Innovations stock plummets as CEO cancels record-breaking deal. But the real explosion happened on social media. Hashtag dignity over dollars started trending within 2 hours. Hashtag Darius Monroe followed shortly after. Hashtag Black Card Discrimination joined the conversation as people shared their own stories of being questioned, doubted, and dismissed despite their success. The responses were immediate and passionate. Finally, someone with the courage to put principle over profit. This is what real leadership looks like. Hashtag dignity over dollars. A Black CEO just walked away from $3.7 billion because he refused to accept disrespect. If that's not power, I don't know what is. Hashtag Darius Monroe. You all still don't understand. It doesn't matter how successful we get, how much money we make, how many degrees we have. They still see us as not belonging. Respect to Darius Monroe for saying enough. The support wasn't universal. Financial analysts questioned the decision's impact on shareholders. Business commentators debated whether personal grievances should influence corporate decisions. Conservative voices criticized what they saw as an overreaction to a minor incident. But the overwhelming response from the Black community was one of pride and validation. Dr. Angela Robinson, a professor of business ethics at Howard University, tweeted, "What Darius Monroe did today will be studied in business schools for generations. This is what it looks like when a leader refuses to compromise their values for financial gain." The hotel's response was swift and panicked. By noon, the Bellevue Royale had issued a statement. "We are deeply disappointed by the unfortunate incident that occurred this morning. The behavior described does not reflect our values or standards of service. We are conducting a thorough investigation and will take appropriate action." But the damage was done. #Boycott Bellevue Royale started trending alongside the other hashtags. Guests began canceling reservations. Corporate clients questioned whether they wanted to host events at a hotel associated with discrimination. The hotel's general manager, Patricia Williams, called Darius personally. "Mr. Monroe, I want to apologize profusely for what happened this morning. The employee in question has been suspended pending investigation. We would be honored to host your company's events in the future, and I'd like to discuss how we can make this right." Darius's response was polite but firm. MS. Williams, "I appreciate your call, but this isn't about one employee. This is about a culture that allows such behavior to occur. The apology should go to every guest who's been made to feel unwelcome in your establishment." The ripple effect spread beyond social media and hotel management. Other Black executives began sharing their own stories of discrimination in professional settings. The conversation evolved from a single incident to a broader examination of how racism persisted in corporate America, even at the highest levels. CNN reached out for an interview. MSNBC wanted him on their morning show. The New York Times requested a quote for their front-page story. Everyone wanted to understand what could drive a successful CEO to walk away from such a massive deal. But Darius wasn't ready to talk to the media yet. He needed time to process what he'd done, to understand the full implications of his decision. Sitting in his office that afternoon, looking out at the city skyline, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the satisfaction of a successful deal or the pride of a financial victory, but the deep, quiet peace that comes from acting in accordance with your values. His phone rang constantly. His inbox overflowed with interview requests, support messages, and business inquiries. Reporters camped outside his office building. The story had taken on a life of its own. The stock market had reacted predictably. Westgate Innovations shares dropped 12% in after-hours trading. Financial analysts were calling it a costly mistake and questioning his judgment. Shareholders were demanding explanations. But for every critical voice, there were 3 supportive ones. Young entrepreneurs reached out, thanking him for showing them that success didn't require accepting disrespect. Established executives, both Black and white, privately messaged their admiration for his courage. His mother called that evening. "Son," she said, her voice filled with pride, "your father would be so proud. You didn't just cancel a business deal today. You made a statement that will echo for generations." As the sun set over the city, Darius realized that his decision had become something bigger than he'd anticipated. It wasn't just about one man's refusal to accept discrimination. It had become a catalyst for a broader conversation about dignity, respect, and the price of progress. The news cycle would continue. The analysis would persist. The debate would rage on social media and in boardrooms across the country. But this was just the beginning. 6 months later, the business world looked different. What had started as one man's refusal to accept discrimination had evolved into something unprecedented. A movement that forced corporate America to confront uncomfortable truths about inclusion, respect, and the cost of maintaining the status quo. Darius Monroe had become more than a CEO. He'd become a symbol. The immediate aftermath had been challenging. Westgate Innovation stock had volatility for weeks as investors tried to understand the long-term implications of his decision. Some shareholders called for his resignation. Others praised his moral leadership. The company's board of directors spent countless hours in emergency meetings, trying to navigate the unprecedented situation. But something remarkable happened as the dust settled. Instead of being ostracized by the business community, Darius found himself flooded with new opportunities. Companies that had never considered partnerships with Westgate Innovations suddenly wanted to work with the CEO who'd chosen principles over profit. We need leaders who understand that business isn't just about maximizing shareholder value, said Jennifer Martinez, CEO of Global Solutions Incorporated, as she announced a new joint venture with Westgate Innovations. Darius proved that integrity isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. The partnership with Global Solutions was worth $2.1 billion, not as large as the canceled deal, but significant enough to prove that taking a stand didn't mean financial suicide. Other deals followed. Companies that valued ethical leadership sought out Westgate Innovations specifically because of Darius's reputation for uncompromising integrity. More importantly, the incident had sparked a broader conversation about discrimination in corporate settings. Harvard Business School launched a case study on the Monroe decision, examining the intersection of personal values and business leadership. MBA students debated whether Darius had made the right choice, but the consensus was clear. His decision had redefined what courageous leadership looked like. The Bellevue Royale became a case study in crisis management, or rather, mismanagement. Despite their initial apology and the suspension of the employee involved, the hotel struggled to recover from the negative publicity. Bookings dropped 30% in the following quarter. Corporate clients moved their events to competitors. The hotel eventually hired a new management team and invested millions in diversity training, but the damage to their reputation took years to repair. Brandon, the clerk whose comments had triggered the entire incident, became an unlikely beneficiary of the situation. After being terminated from the hotel, he publicly apologized and began working with diversity organizations to help educate others about unconscious bias. His story became a reminder that even well-intentioned people could perpetuate harmful stereotypes. But the real transformation was happening in boardrooms across America. Companies began implementing what became known as Monroe Clauses in their vendor agreements, provisions that required business partners to demonstrate concrete commitments to diversity and inclusion. The clauses weren't just symbolic, they carried financial penalties for discriminatory behavior. Goldman Sachs announced that they would no longer take companies public unless they had at least one diverse board member. McKinsey & Company published research showing that companies with diverse leadership teams outperformed their peers by 35%. The business case for inclusion was becoming undeniable. Darius found himself at the center of this transformation. Speaking invitations poured in from business schools, corporate conferences, and leadership summits. His TED Talk, The Price of Dignity, garnered over 10 million views and became required viewing in business ethics courses. Leadership isn't about making easy decisions, he said during a keynote at the National Association of Corporate Directors annual conference. It's about making the right decisions, even when they're costly. Especially when they're costly. The movement he'd inadvertently started extended beyond corporate America. Young professionals, inspired by his example, began refusing to accept discriminatory behavior in their own workplaces. The hashtag dignity over dollars became a rallying cry for anyone who'd been asked to compromise their values for financial gain. Dr. Michelle Thompson, a sociologist at Stanford University, studied the Monroe effect and its impact on workplace culture. What we're seeing is a fundamental shift in how people think about the relationship between personal values and professional success, she explained. Darius Monroe showed that you don't have to choose between integrity and achievement. You can have both. The ripple effects reached international markets. European companies began adopting similar inclusion standards. Asian corporations started diversity initiatives specifically to attract business from American firms that had embraced the Monroe Standard. The global business community was slowly but surely changing. Darius's company thrived in this new environment. Westgate Innovations became the employer of choice for talented professionals who wanted to work for a company that aligned with their values. The company's workforce became more diverse, more innovative, and more productive. Financial performance improved as employee satisfaction reached record highs. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in the stories that people shared. The hashtag #DignityOverDollars movement had given voice to countless individuals who'd experienced discrimination but had never felt empowered to speak out. Their stories created a comprehensive record of how bias persisted in professional settings and how it could be challenged. One story that particularly resonated was from Maria Santos, a Latina executive who'd been passed over for promotion despite outperforming her peers. Inspired by Darius's example, she filed a formal complaint with HR and eventually received the promotion she deserved. I realized that staying silent wasn't protecting my career, it was limiting it, she said. The academic world took notice as well. Business schools began teaching entire courses on values-based leadership, using Darius's decision as a foundational case study. Students learned that financial success and ethical behavior weren't mutually exclusive, they were mutually reinforcing. Subscribe if you want to see more stories of people who chose dignity over dollars. 2 years after the incident, Darius was invited to speak at the same hotel where it had all began. The Bellevue Royale had undergone a complete transformation. The new management had implemented comprehensive diversity training, hired a diverse workforce, and created an environment where all guests were treated with equal respect. Standing in the renovated lobby, Darius reflected on how much had changed. The marble floors were the same, the crystal chandeliers still caught the light, but the atmosphere was completely different. The hotel now celebrated diversity rather than merely tolerating it. Change is possible, he told the audience of hotel executives and hospitality industry leaders. But it requires courage, the courage to admit mistakes, the courage to do better, and the courage to make decisions that prioritize human dignity over short-term profits. The lesson of Darius Monroe's story wasn't just about standing up to discrimination. It was about the power of individual action to create systemic change. One person's refusal to accept the unacceptable had sparked a movement that transformed how businesses thought about inclusion, respect, and leadership. The $3.7 billion deal he'd walked away from had been replaced by something far more valuable, a legacy of integrity that would influence business practices for generations to come. Young entrepreneurs now had a different model of success to follow. Instead of achieving wealth at any cost, they could pursue prosperity while maintaining their principles. The Monroe decision had proven that dignity and dollars weren't mutually exclusive, they were complementary forces that could drive both financial success and social progress. Today, Darius Monroe sits in his corner office overlooking the city skyline, but he's no longer just a CEO. He's a catalyst for change, a symbol of what happens when someone refuses to trade their dignity for dollars. Westgate Innovations has become more than a technology company. It's a beacon for ethical leadership in corporate America. The company's valuation has reached $12 billion, proving that doing the right thing doesn't just feel good, it pays off. But Darius's true legacy isn't measured in stock prices or quarterly earnings. It's measured in the thousands of professionals who've found the courage to speak up when they face discrimination. It's measured in the companies that have transformed their cultures rather than lose talented employees. It's measured in the young entrepreneurs who now know that success doesn't require sacrificing their values. The Monroe decision has become a turning point in corporate history. Business schools teach it as a case study in values-based leadership. Companies reference it when making difficult ethical choices. And every time someone chooses principle over profit, they're walking in the footsteps of a man who proved that dignity is worth more than any deal. But the fight isn't over. Every day, in conference rooms and hotel lobbies, in restaurants and retail stores, people are still being made to feel like they don't belong. The color of their skin, their gender, their accent, their background. Something about them is being used to question their worth, their competence, their right to be treated with respect. This is where you come in. You might not be facing a $3.7 billion decision, but you face choices every day. Choices about whether to speak up when you witness discrimination. Choices about whether to challenge bias in your workplace. Choices about whether to support businesses that align with your values. What will you choose when your moment comes? Will you stay silent to keep the peace? Will you look the other way to protect your position? Will you compromise your principles for convenience? Or will you follow Darius Monroe's example and decide that some things are worth more than money? The power to create change isn't reserved for CEOs and executives. It belongs to every person who refuses to accept discrimination as normal. Every person who stands up for what's right, regardless of the cost. Every person who believes that dignity isn't negotiable. Your voice matters. Your choices matter. Your courage matters. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own values, if it inspired you to take a stand, then share it. Let others know that dignity over dollars isn't just a hashtag, it's a way of life. Hit that like button if you believe respect should be universal, not conditional. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. And subscribe to this channel because we're going to keep telling the stories of people who chose courage over comfort, principle over profit, and dignity over dollars. The next time someone questions whether you belong, remember Darius Monroe. Remember that you don't have to prove your worth to anyone. You just have to know it yourself. Because when you know your worth, you'll never settle for less than the respect you deserve. That's the legacy of the $3.7 billion decision. That's the power of choosing dignity over dollars.